it's incredibly hard to play Mozart well. And you can never think, oh, now I've got it under my fingers, I've done it. Because that's where you start, once it's under your fingers. What was it Schnabel said? That it's too hard...
Too hard for...
No, it's too easy for children. Too hard for grown-ups.
Yes.
Sorry. And brilliant.
We are here in Chicago at the cinematic backdrop of Michigan Avenue, home to the city's cultural institutions and the heart of a truly dynamic musical center of the country. Here at the historic Fine Arts Building, we meet with eminent British conductor and scholar Dame Jane Glover.
Dame Jane, it's such a delight to welcome you here.
I'm happy to be here, Zsolt. Thank you for asking me.
I wanted to begin by asking about your 2005 book about Mozart, Mozart's Women. How did this idea come together and what was the concept?
There are so many books about Mozart, and there was no new ground that I was going to cover. I wasn't going to sort of sit in dusty libraries and turn up letters and documents that people hadn't done. But I did want to tell the story of him through the people around him, and particularly the women in his life, because they were terribly important to him all the way through his life. Obviously his mother and his sister during his childhood, and then his wife and her sisters, the incredible family of musicians that he married into. Of course, his wife's sister, Aloysia Weber, was one of the best singers of her time. And he adored her before he adored Constanze. And he wrote some of his best music for her. But, he would have written good music for whoever. It's just that he discovered through meeting good people and writing for them, he discovered the best way of writing for the human voice. And I'm sure all singers will tell you that. I think it's the same with all his music, but specifically with singers, that he always challenges you, but he never defeats you. And I'm sure you as a pianist would agree with that. It's incredibly hard to play Mozart well, and you can never think, oh, now I've got it under my fingers, I've done it, because that's where you start, once it's under your fingers. What was it Schnabel said? That it's too hard...
Too hard for...
No, it's too easy for children. Too hard for grown-ups.
Yes.
Sorry. And brilliant. But, other composers do defeat you. There is music that is unplayable, even in the 18th century or early 19th century. I'm thinking of Ludwig van Beethoven, for instance, which is sometimes really unplayable. And I think Mozart never did that. He never wrote beyond the capability of an instrument or a person, but he always made you find that limit.
Did you go so far as to have a theory about where would Mozart have been had it not been for those women in his life? Did you try to speculate?
No, that's a very good question. I think he would have been who he is. I mean, with such bursting genius in whether it's a young child or whatever, that is going to find its way to the top. But I think what is lovely about the women in his life is that his sister was a lovely companion in his childhood. His mother was an extraordinary figure who sort of looked after the whole family on these immense tours when the children were very small, all over the north of Europe. But also there have been some misconceptions, shall we say, throughout history as to who they were and how they were. For instance, the biggest glaring historical error really was Constanze, Mozart's wife, who over the centuries had been much vilified, and particularly since Peter Schaffer's brilliant play, Amadeus, and then the slightly less brilliant movie, Amadeus, which portrayed Constanze as a vulgar airhead. She wasn't at all. She was an incredibly well-educated woman, much more educated, actually, officially, than Mozart himself. She was a fine musician, as were all her sisters. And as we discover, towards the end of Mozart's life, and certainly, sadly, after it, she had a phenomenal business head on her. And it is to her that we must be grateful for actually organising these sort of piles of manuscript that were lying around the apartment, which could have just all been binned and lost, if she hadn't been determined to get his fame lasting forever, which, my goodness, she has. In the 18th century, fame was quite passing. You could be here today, gone tomorrow. And without that security of print being published, who knew what would happen to certain composers? And we're still discovering composers who never quite made it to the security of the printing press. So that was a story to tell, and in telling it, I got very close, not only to them, but of course to him. And so, although it was, of course, about them, it is actually my book about him. One of them. I've written another one since.
What's the next one?
Well, it's called Mozart in Italy. It's, this 13, 14-year-old Austrian boy was commissioned by Milan, the greatest opera centre in the world at the time, to write an opera for their next opera season. I mean, unheard of. And he'd sort of impressed everybody so much. And so that was, and after that he did two more. But it's an idea I'd had for some time to concentrate on the three extraordinary trips Mozart made to Italy between the ages of 13 and 16. Now, those are impressionable ages for anybody, whether you're a genius or not. And, of course, Italy is so seductive and it influences everybody in so many different ways. And basically, these at the most impressionable age, Italy did for Mozart what it does for all of us. Opened his eyes to amazing things, opened his ears to amazing things. I mean, these years of, puberty, frankly, the boy was growing up, were largely experienced in Italy. And that is indeed where he discovered girls for the first time. And, not the first time, but he certainly discovered them. But more to the point, and this is really what the book is about, he was taken seriously by the best practitioners in the opera world at the time, and that means not just the promoters, but the singers. He had the equivalent of Renee Fleming singing for him at the theatre in Milan. And in his first opera that he wrote for Milan, when he was 14, it was a sort of workshop situation. I discovered all this when working on it, that the singers, he had to have the recitatives written before he arrived, but then he was to write the arias when he'd met the singers, which is entirely sensible, because you sort of meet the singers and get to know them and see what they can do, and then write for them. And in the case of Mitridate, Re di Ponte, which was his first of the three Italian operas, we can see him trying something out and then having another version, trying something, which he didn't have to do in later operas. He would just write fluently, assess a voice and get it down. And in Mitridate, he has 2, 3, sometimes 5 goes at finding the right aria. And he's only 14, for heaven's sake. But those pieces that he wrote in those Milan years are phenomenal, and so much better than most music written by most grown-up composers at the same time. And by the way, particularly that very first trip, he and his father had travelled all over Italy, down as far as Naples, and back again in a sort of 15-month trip, and had enormous honours. I mean, the Pope gave him a fantastic honour, and he became a member of every Accademia Filarmonica throughout the land, which, although he was a teenager, he's supposed to be 20 years old or 21 years old to get into these things, and so on. It was just a wonderful time for him. But he never went back, interestingly. But in a way, he took Italy with him wherever he went.
So there were the books about Mozart. You've recorded Mozart. You've performed Mozart as a really central part of your musical life. Why Mozart? How did Mozart come into your life? What draws you to his music?
I'm often asked this. It might be a simple accident that when I was very small, my father got his first long-playing gramophone, and the first record he bought was Dennis Brain playing the horn concertos, all 4 of them. And so by the time I was 8 or something, I knew these things by heart. And that sort of entered my DNA, I think. And after that, I was hooked. And I speak as somebody who performs, the great music of Bach, for instance, than which there is no greater challenge or reward. And yet, if you had to pin me down and say, no, you're only allowed one, it would be Mozart for me. And, he really is in me now. I conduct his music from memory, pretty much all of it, including the operas. And there barely a week goes by that I'm not, unless there's a pandemic, that I'm not conducting Mozart, so that Mozart's music is going through my head and my hands and my heart. And in a curious way, I feel charged by him.
You met Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears early on.
Very early, yeah. By accident, I walked into a very early rehearsal, a rehearsal for one of the very first performances of his War Requiem in Hereford Cathedral, when I was about 12 or 13. And I had no idea what this music was. And just hearing this music in rehearsal blew me away. And I insisted to my parents that we went back the next day to hear the concert. And it was indeed the War Requiem. Huge, huge, huge thing. And I was then sort of hooked on this man, and I tried to get as much of his music as I could. And then a few years later, Britten and Pears came to give a concert in my area. In fact, they were giving 3 concerts in my area, and they were staying quite near to where we lived. My father was headmaster of what you would call a private school, which we ridiculously call public schools in the UK. And the school hall was going to be one of the venues where the Ben and Peter were to give their recital. And he had met them and said, if you need anything from my wife would look after you, just go and ring the doorbell at the headmaster's house and my wife will look after. He neglected to tell this to anybody. And I'll never forget, I'd just come home from school one afternoon about 4:30, and I was in the kitchen with my mother and the doorbell rang. I'll go and see who that is, darling, would you? So I went and opened the door, and there on the doorstep, beautiful, elegant, were Ben and Peter, looking like one of the record sleeves I had upstairs, And in they came. I knew they were coming, of course. I knew that they were going to be giving this recital. But I had no idea they were going to turn up on our doorstep. And over the next 2 or 3 days, they came in more than once. And Ben was absolutely amazing. I mean, I, of course, didn't call him anything other than Mr. Britten. But he obviously recognised something in me, that it was just some enthusiasm and maybe, I don't know, he talked to me a lot. And, it's often said that he was wonderful with musical boys. Well, let me tell you, he was brilliant with this fat schoolgirl too, who knew every note of music he'd written. And he discovered it was my birthday the next month, and he sent me tickets to Peter Grimes at Sadler's Wells. Subsequently, when I left my school before going to university, he invited me to his festival in Aldborough to be work on the apprentice scheme, just to be a dog's body and run around and do things and hear 4 concerts a day and see people in rehearsal. And that was such an incredible experience for me to see up close, really, the life I have now. And to see, all of it, the rewards and the immense hard work and the discomforts and the joys and all of it. And let me tell you, there's one other thing I have to tell you. The circle came full for me when I did my first War Requiem. You're too young to remember, but can you remember historically what happened on November the 9th, 1989?
Well, that's around the time of a lot of geopolitical shifts.
Well, the Berlin Wall came down. Can you imagine the atmosphere in the hall that night? I can hardly talk about it now without welling up. I mean, I'm the enemy you killed, my friend. You know, doing that music from the greatest pacifist in the world on that day. People still talk about it now, having been either playing it or being in the audience. They could never forget the night the Berlin Wall came down because we were doing the war thing.
You mentioned your father as collecting records, as a music lover. Did you come from a musical family?
Not really. I mean, my parents met singing in an amateur choir when they were both undergraduates at Oxford, actually, during the Second World War. But then they continued to sing in amateur choral societies all their lives, actually, until into their 80s. But no, my family was an academic family, and I'm the only one who's a professional musician.
Were they supportive of your musical?
They were. When I said, having done a doctorate at Oxford, and where I also did my undergraduate work, that actually I thought I was going to try and be a conductor in days when there weren't many women doing this at all, if any. I think they were completely appalled. But they didn't stop me or try to stop me. So in that sense, they were supportive. But I think they knew that I had some degrees to fall back on and that, I could possibly, do something else.
Did you feel like that was an act of courage? I imagine that being a conductor anyway comes as a huge leap of faith. But if there are additional challenges, whether it be perceptions or just the fact that for a long time being a conductor seemed to be mostly a men's club.
Yes, I tried not to think about it, to be honest, at the beginning, but it was very hard not to because people drew attention to it a lot. And the landscape has changed enormously, has it not, in the last 40 years, which is how long I've been at this job. And maybe a bit more, actually. So, yes, it was lonely out there. And I'm certain that at some stage I was not offered opportunities because I was a woman and it was sort of irrelevant. But there were also, I think, times when I was offered opportunities because I was a woman. And both those are wrong. The only thing that matters is whether it's any good.
And as we continue our conversation here in Chicago, I just wanted to mention to anyone who is watching, we are in the spectacularly beautiful Fine Arts building, which is along Michigan Avenue, so we hear a little bit of street noise. We also have musicians warming up in the other rooms. So with that being said, I wanted to ask you about something you touched upon a couple of times. Chicago has had a very, very close place in your musical life. Why are we here in Chicago, and what is Music from the Baroque?
Music of the Baroque actually is an organisation that's been going for 52 years now, and I was appointed 20 years ago, or maybe actually 22. The joy of this group is that we're not a period orchestra, as you would think from our name that we play period instruments. We don't. Except we do, and I'll tell you about the exceptions that we make. But it's a little bit like the way Neville Marriner started the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, in London all those years ago. He just took the best players from the London orchestras, put them together in a smashing band, and had the Academy of St Martin in the Fields. And here, half my players probably come from the CSO and half from the Lyric Opera Orchestra, and there are others who are on the freelance scene. But this means that we have the best players in Chicago, and they come to play our repertory because they love it. And often we are the third session in their day, that they will rehearse, half of them will be rehearsing Bruckner with Mutti in the morning, and the other half will be rehearsing Wagner with somebody else that morning. And they're all performing in the evening, but in the afternoons they come to us and play Bach and Handel and Haydn and Mozart and Vivaldi. And I always take it takes us about 5 minutes to find our sound, when they've come from playing big Bruckner and just play Bach.
Dame Jane, was there a point at which you started to identify, hone in on, and trust your own artistic voice?
Oh, I don't know if I've ever done that yet. No, well, that's a facetious answer. I'm sorry. It's, as you said earlier, it's tough being a young conductor starting out. And of course, one is beset with anxiety and incident often of and thoughts of, that didn't go as well as it should. But if one knows what one wants, in a completely different context, somebody once said to me, just trust your instincts. And that is such great advice. Go with your instinct, go with your heart. What is it you want to say about this piece of music? And I suppose what builds the confidence to trust it in the way that you ask your question is when people ask you back because they want more of it,
When I read your biography, I see an incredibly long list of accomplishments. Did it ever feel like the path in front of you didn't seem clear?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. And the big turning point, actually, was when I went to Glyndebourne, to the opera company there. I learnt my trade, and it was a sort of another alma mater for me, because I was assisting people like Bernard Haitink and Simon Rattle, and who, of course, is younger than I am, but was always sort of 50 years older than all of us. He was inexperienced. He was just fabulous, and still is. Dear Bernard, we've lost now, but of course he was really my mentor, and I assisted him both at Glyndebourne and at Covent Garden, and it was, just one learned every time he stood on the podium. And also, more to the point, I felt I learnt from the great directors I worked with, from the great singers I worked with, and just from that, the whole ethos of the place of putting it on to perfection. And the standards I learnt at Glyndebourne, I've tried to apply everywhere I've gone since, from the head of music staff that I learnt from, and it was just a most wonderful experience. And then in those years when I was there, I was also, I got music directorships of the London Mozart Players, and also the London Choral Society, which had a big profile in London at the time. And I was beginning to do some work on television, so suddenly the path was much clearer, And since then, I mean, it's taken some strange turns, perhaps. I mean, I didn't work here in America until I was, in my 40s, I think. I was quite late. And in a way, it was like starting all over again, except that this time one knew what one was doing. So one arrived with a lot more confidence.
You talked about the musicians who mentored you, and you mentioned mentoring other musicians, and I know about the Glover School. What does effective mentoring, what does effective music education look like?
Well, and I thought then that, because I come from a generation of conductors, shout it not, but who, I've never had a conducting lesson in my life. Now there are conducting programs all over the world, and they're brilliant. But there weren't any when my training was academic. And a lot of my generation, people like John Eliot Gardner and Mark Elder and Andrew Davies, they all came through the university route, as I did. And They did rather better than me, rather quicker than me. But, I'm here to. So I was sort of reluctant to feel I could teach anybody else how to do this. But working with students of that ability is thrilling. The standard at the Royal Academy of Music is incredibly high. And it's really to encourage more women to have the confidence to think they can do it. And as we said earlier, the landscape has changed enormously in the last 10 years, and one meets these great women conductors doing great things all over the place. It's still not an even playing field, and so we've still got to get these younger kids believing that they can do it too, and so that's what we're doing.
Dame Jane, thank you so much for joining us on the series. It's been an absolute delight to have you. Thank you for joining us here in Chicago.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.